Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're keeping lovely and warm, and that you're drinking lovely hot drinks, and whatever it is that you're doing, that you're making sure that you're relaxing and making the most of this lovely time of the year. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Stuart sat bolt upright in bed. He could swear he'd heard a knock at the door. Was he mistaken? It could easily be the howling wind, he thought. But no, he definitely heard a distinctive rapping sound. He cautiously climbed out of bed, tiptoeing towards the window that faced the front of the house, overlooking the street, to see if he could discern any signs of movement. He twitched back a fraction of the curtain, to peer out surreptitiously over the front yard. It was a dark, tenebrous night, with a half-moon obscured by a hazy, claggy mist, but it was still bucketing down with rain. The wind whistled through the trees. Stuart could see the familiar long ribbon of asphalt, gleaming with wetness under the assault and thrashing power of the rain, caught under the infusive light of the street lamps. He noticed the semi-detached houses on either side of the street, all swept in darkness, as most of the residential houses had motion-activated outside lights. But no one's lights had been stimulated by any random outside movement. Everything seemed unusually quiet in terms of any signs of human activity or lone trucks driving down the road. Apart from nature's elements, of course. He could distinctly hear the pelting sound of the rain beating down on the roof, along with the punnelling sounds of the wind whipping the wooden rafters so they rattled precariously. He noted that the flowering cherry and elm trees that framed either side of the street jiggled their boughs like belly dancers as the torrential rain came down in sheets. That was when he noticed one of the boughs of the crabapple trees that grew directly outside his aunt's bedroom had been knocking against the window, making a curious rapping sound. It was certainly nasty weather out there, he thought. Then he heard the knocking sound again, but discerned it was not the crabapple tree that was making that noise. It was something else. He couldn't isolate that sound specifically. It wasn't the wind, nor the rain, or the crabapple tree. No, it was definitely something else, but what? He couldn't imagine. Maybe there really was someone at the front door. He knew that Hattie had not installed a doorbell, as she simply despised all modern gadgets that made nasty clangorous noises and interfered with the peace. The knocking sound started up again, only this time it sounded significantly harder, much more urgent. Then he was in no doubt that there had to be someone at the door. He glanced briefly at the large clock on the mantel of the bedroom fireplace. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. What the hell, he thought. Who would be at the door at this ungodly, insane time of the morning? He knew that Hattie Fairbank's house had been raided a couple of times by burglars before, but nothing had ever been taken, so he felt his hackles rise ever so slightly. Should he be concerned about someone disturbing him at this time of the morning? He reached for his dressing gown hanging behind the hook on the bedroom door, wrapping it around his body generously, while plunging his feet into a pair of sheepskin slippers. He scrambled hurriedly down the long, sweeping, ornate mahogany staircase. I could just ignore the knocking, he thought to himself. Then maybe whoever they are will go away. The knocking persisted, so he found himself in the entrance hall, peeping through the peephole in the door. He could see a young woman standing in the outside entrance, looking completely drenched to the skin. He surreptitiously opened the door. "Yes," he said. A young woman with blonde hair, made darker by the fact that it was wet, stood in the doorway carrying a suitcase in her hands, looking like a half-drowned rat. Her teeth were chattering, she was so cold. "I'm sorry to wake you up at this unearthly time. Is Hattie here?" asked the girl. "Hattie Fairbank." "Sorry," said Stuart. "She's away. She's my aunt. I'm house-sitting for her, taking care of her indoor plants and her 2 cats. "Oh dear," said the woman, a frown beginning to develop on her feminine heart-shaped face. "It's a real bummer, it really is. I'm from LA, you see. I was hoping to crash here with Hattie for a few days. She always said when I was in these parts, I was very welcome to stay over." Stuart did not quite know how to react to this unforeseen, rather worrisome confession. The girl looked harmless enough, but he didn't like the idea of inviting an innocuous, perfect stranger into the house whom he knew nothing about. Was that not inviting trouble? She could be anyone. He didn't know her from Adam, irrespective of how benign she appeared on the surface. "There is one big problem," he said, looking a tad uncomfortable. "I can't invite you to stay. You must appreciate Hattie is not here, but you are very welcome to come in and dry off. Maybe change into some fresh clothes in the bathroom. Wait for the rain to subside and recede. I can also make you a cup of hot chocolate if you like, to warm you up before you make tracks again." "Now you're speaking my language," said the young woman, giving Stuart an irresistible smile. "I'd love to come in if I may. My name is Shelley, by the way. You are?" "Stuart." "Funny," said Stuart, his brow furrowing in perplexment. "Hattie's never mentioned you to me before. I'm usually very well acquainted with all her friends." Shelley ignored Stuart's doubtful, cynical comments by simply shrugging her shoulders and not saying a single word. Soon she was drying her drenched locks of hair in the kitchen with a large fluffy towel that Stuart had handed to her. "That's better. I feel infinitely more human," she said. Stuart directed her to the downstairs bathroom, where she quickly changed from her saturated clothes into a fresh, dry pair of jeans and a sweatshirt, and then promptly returned to Hattie's cosy country kitchen. "I really appreciate this," she said. "I hitchhiked here tonight. I was very fortunate to grab a lift with a very nice truck driver. He gave me a ride the whole way. He was making a delivery from LA to Seattle. It's 17.5 hours trip, a complete nightmare as you can imagine. My bum is literally killing me from sitting in one position for hours at a time. It would have made so much more sense to fly. Anyway, he dropped me off a moment ago at this crazy time. I never expected to get caught up in this onslaught. It's certainly bucketing down now." She watched Stuart as he heated the milk, adding it to the hot chocolate mixture. "That looks absolutely delicious," she said. "Just what I need." "So what do you do in Los Angeles then?" Stuart asked to make polite conversation. The girl giggled. "Well, I'm trying to get into acting, so I waitress to support myself, like so many hopefuls. I spent my life going to auditions, but it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. So much competition. The trouble is in Hollywood, it's not what you know, it's who you know. It really helps to know the movers and shakers in the business, of course. I mean, there's so many talented people out there looking for a break. Sometimes they don't even get a look in. It's not about fairness at all, or even natural talent. The raw, horrifying truth is that luck plays a quintessential role on the ladder to success." "I don't know why you put yourself through all that degrading indignity," said Stuart. "I couldn't do it myself. One chagrin disappointment after another, being rejected and spurned over and over again. That's got to be tough for anyone." "You know, I ask myself that question all the time. Why do I bother? You're right, it's brutal. But since I was a little girl, I've always hankered and yearned to be an actress. It's always been my big dream. So I guess you just learn to develop a tough, resilient and buoyant hide. Not let it get to you when you're turned down. You have to be resolutely determined in this line of business." Stuart almost felt sorry for the Paglosian young girl, secretly thinking to himself that she was more than a little naive, impressionable and dewy-eyed. He'd heard about it all the time, young people champing at the bit to make it big in Hollywood. An ingenious jejune dream of which so many aspired to. I mean, Shelley was pretty, yes, that was true, but then so were hundreds of other Hollywood hopefuls. There was nothing about her that stood out to him as exceptionally special. She didn't have that wow X factor that you so often saw in some of the greats. But then who was he to pass comment or to judge? He didn't know a damn thing about acting. "Nice place you have here," said Shelley, looking around. Again Stuart's brow furrowed. "You mean you've never been to Hattie's house before?" He found this revelation more than a little bewildering. "Well, in truth, my mother was great friends with Hattie. She met her at many of the antique fairs she attends. I got to know her through my mother, you see." "Oh, I see," said Stuart, beginning to relax. "Well, that would make a lot of sense. Hattie always goes to antique fairs. She's fascinated by vintage regalia. She knows quite a few antique dealers. My mother says she's got quite the eye for a good collectible."
Hattie's got lots of taste. Look around at the quality of her furnishings. But I know absolutely nothing about antiques, I have to admit.
Oh, I can see that when I came down from the bathroom. I couldn't help but notice the vintage furniture, the contemporary artwork on the walls, the fabulous rugs on the floors. No, she's got styles and oodles of it. That's clear to see, she acknowledged warmly. Once Shelley had finished her hot chocolate, which she effusively declared with no restraint to her enthusiasm as the most delicious chocolate drink she'd ever tasted, she made no attempt to go. The rain had thankfully receded, while the wind's nagging temper had finally subsided. So Stuart looked at Shelley with expectation on his face, a look of, well, are you going to go now? But for a while she barely seemed to budge, almost as if she had no intention of moving a muscle. Finally she said with an audacious impertinence, I know I should go, but if Hattie were here she would definitely insist I stayed. I'm so exhausted after that 17 hours on the road. Getting back into a truck is a daunting prospect for me. Couldn't I just stay here until the morning? Then I'll be out of your hair, I promise you.
Stuart shrugged. Very well, but only because you're a friend of Hattie's. Normally I would phone her to ask if you could stay, but I can't. You see, unfortunately Hattie cannot abide cell phones. She's on a cruise at the moment. Gave me strict instructions not to contact her, except by email, and only if it was an exceedingly urgent emergency. You see, poor old Hattie recently had her feathers rarely ruffled, on 2 separate occasions, I might add. Someone had completely raided her house, broken in, turned the place upside down. It looked like a complete pigsty. She returned home to find drawers pulled out, her settee shredded with all the stuffing spilled over the floor. Even the contents of her fridge had been ransacked. It was like someone had gone through the entire place with a fine tooth comb. But the bizarre thing is that nothing was missing. So she's more than a little anxious, which is another reason why she wanted me to house-sit for her. She couldn't abide returning home again to that kind of chaos. So I'm naturally, well, very protective and guarded over her place, as you can understand.
Stuart couldn't help noticing Shelley flush a bright pink colour, the colour of guilt. She spoke quickly, almost tripping over her words in her haste to get them out. And unambiguously so too. Who could blame you in the circumstances? How extraordinary that someone would raid her house, taking absolutely nothing. What do you think the burglars were after?
That's the question Hattie would like to find answers to. It was like whoever they were strategically, prudently looking for something. But what? I cannot imagine. I mean, Hattie's reasonably well off, but she's most certainly not loaded.
It is odd, agreed Shelley.
Stuart led Shelley to the spare room. Make yourself comfortable. I'll see you in the morning.
Thanks, Stuart, for letting me stay. I truly appreciate it a lot.
Well, it's only for one night, Stuart reminded her.
When Stuart retired to his bed, he found himself pondering over the unheralded, impetuous visit from this strange, mysterious young girl at the dead of night, drenched to the skin like a drowned rat. He could hardly have turned her away from his aunt's house in the rather fickle, vacillating weather, but he couldn't help thinking that the young girl's fortuitous arrival at Hattie's home out of the blue like this was more than a little odd. He knew that to send the woman out in the capricious elements again was possibly not the most chivalrous thing for him to do, but it had been a bit presumptuous, rather cheeky and impudent of her to invite herself to stay overnight like this. But then it really was late. Where could the poor girl have gone at this ungodly hour? Was she really a friend of his aunt's, he wondered? But if that was the case, why had his aunt never mentioned her to him before? In truth, she seemed innocent enough. She looked to be in her early 20s, petite with long blonde hair and blue eyes. Stuart reluctantly pulled the sheets over his body. He could feel exhaustion overwhelm him, as if the long night had sucked the energy out of him. There were the 2 lovable, familiar, lumpy forms weighing down the duvet with their ample weight. It was, of course, the cats. Stuart reached out to stroke one of them. Little Willow rolled over on his back and began to purr loudly like a steam engine. Stuart closed his eyes, drifting off into a deep sleep, soon lost in the world of his dreams. As the sunlight floated through the open part of the curtain that Stuart had failed to fully close the previous night,
The whole north-facing bedroom was bathed in prisms of bright light. Stuart opened his eyes, immediately climbing out of bed to close the opening in the curtain. He was about to return to the cosy confines of his bed for a little more shut-eye when he heard a crashing and clanging sound coming from the kitchen. And then the memories of last night's unseasoned, unpremeditated guest came flooding back like a bad dream. How he wished that Shelley girl wasn't here, as it was awkward having to throw out a house guest that you instinctively sensed was eager to hang around like the proverbial bad smell. He groaned inwardly, knowing that he better check up on the visitor. By the sounds of things, she appeared to be making herself comfortably at home. Stuart threw on a pair of jeans and a sweater, straightened out the bed without upsetting the two sleeping cats, and then quickly darted down the staircase. As he entered the kitchen, he was hit with the delicious aroma of freshly baked pancakes and bacon. Shelley was at the range cooking up a big storm, giving Stuart a huge Hollywood smile, which he noticed didn't reach her blue eyes. He got the distinct impression that the girl seemed to be a little unsettled. "Hungry?" she asked. "Please sit down." Stuart obeyed while Shelley served up plates of pancakes, maple syrup and crispy bacon. She poured him a glass of fresh orange juice and sat down watching him tuck into the pancakes. "Have you not had anything to eat yourself?" he asked. "I'm not hungry. I prefer to drink coffee in the mornings." "There's no need to go to all this trouble on my account. Really there isn't," said Stuart. "However, I must compliment you on your pancakes. They're delicious. The secret is buttermilk. It makes them soft and fluffy." Stuart was inwardly squirming. This young woman was making it significantly harder for him to throw her out, now that she'd gone to so much trouble on his behalf, buttering him up with all these generous favours. "So what are your plans today? Will you be making tracks back to Los Angeles?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," she said impetuously. "Would it really bother you if I stayed on for a couple more days? I promise you I won't be any trouble." Stuart grimaced. He knew this would happen, but he found the words spilling out of his mouth so fast that he didn't have time to catch them. "Of course you can stay. You're welcome. Any friend of Hattie's is a friend of mine." Why the hell had he said that? The words had slipped out of his mouth so smoothly, just like melted butter, but he didn't mean a word of what he'd said. If the truth be told, he wanted to see the back of this young woman. The sooner the better. But she was making it exceedingly hard for him to turf her out, without having to employ blatantly rude tactics. Stuart spent most of the morning busying himself in the backyard, doing all kinds of yard work, like weeding, mowing the lawn, and watering some of his aunt's plant pots, while Shelley sat back on his aunt's cushioned hammock on the wraparound porch, her knees curled up tightly to her chest and her eyes heavily engaged in a Jane Austen book. When Stuart came to sit down in the chair next to hers, he brought her an ice-cold glass of Coca-Cola, while opening up a can of beer for himself. He sighed as he took a grateful gulp. "Thirsty business, yard work. But it's invigorating exercise, let me tell you that. Aunt Hattie likes everything to be ship-shape around here." Shelley reached out for her icy-cold glass of Coca-Cola, putting her book down on the table. "I can't help noticing that hole in your fence over there. You could easily wiggle through it and go for a walk in the woods. It's a perfect shortcut. Have you ever done that before?" "Of course I've done it," said Stuart. "So has Aunt Hattie. All the time, actually. It's a beautiful wooded area through there, you know. A lot of people hike up some of those hiking trails. There's an abundance of indigenous wildlife in there. Some magnificent-looking birds. Hattie even gets deers popping through the hole there, grazing on the apples in our yard in season. She's got 5 apple trees here. That's the reason I've never closed the opening to the fence. It's a great point of access to the hiking trails." "So your aunt loves walking as well as antiques?" "Well, she likes those things too, but she likes cats and adores cruisers. I think Hattie to date has been on 14 cruises, if I'm not completely mistaken." "Yikes! That's a plethora of cruises. On the subject of antiques, I remember my mother was with Hattie when she purchased that really stunning-looking pendant. Do you know the one I'm talking about?" "I wouldn't describe it as stunning. It needed a jolly good clean. It was filthy." "Well, surely she's cleaned it up by now, asked Shelley. Surely she's worn it." Stuart looked at Shelley in surprise. Hattie doesn't wear any jewellery. She bought that pendant because she thought it might be special, once she got the grit off it, but she doesn't wear the antique she buys. But she must have cleaned it up by now, surely. Stuart looked at Shelley with a peculiar expression on his face. Why was this young woman continuously talking about an old pendant Hattie had purchased a long while ago? It looked like a cheap bit of junk as far as he was concerned. Shelley, quickly sensing Stuart's enigmatic, filiginous, clandestine look, was very quick to change the conversation, so they ended up talking about Seattle and the best places to eat in town, so Stuart didn't give the matter further scrutiny. That evening Shelley insisted on cooking up a storm for Stuart. "Please let me cook tonight," she begged. "It's the very least I can do in the circumstances, since you've invited me so graciously to stay." "More like you've invited yourself," thought Stuart secretly, feeling a rising level of resentment at how comfortable Shelley was making herself in his aunt's house. There was something paradoxical about her that was seriously bothering him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was a niggling, discomposing feeling he couldn't quite shake off. By all accounts, the young woman seemed young, fresh and innocent, but Stuart was quick to discern she wasn't as squeaky clean as she appeared. That evening Shelley prepared a pasta dish with bacon. Her valiant attempts to make spaghetti carbonara were seriously lacking that oomph factor, or that je ne sais quoi, shall we say, that can take the humble spaghetti dish to the very next level. The rather drab, flavourless, insipid spaghetti was served with a vibrant crisp green salad and a large glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. Stuart barely remembered the beige, rather bland-looking meal. In a trice he began to feel very woozy, as if he was inebriated from drinking too much. He became dizzy and light-headed, and then he must have passed out. It was a long while before Stuart finally opened his eyes, to find himself on the sofa in Hattie's living room, with a comforter thrown across his body, and a pillow placed at the back of his head. There was an unfamiliar bitter taste on his tongue that he couldn't discern. He could hear a thumping sound around the living room that sounded as if someone was rifling through Hattie's stuff. He could hear two distinct voices. One was of a man. The other voice clearly belonged to Shelley. "Well, did you get anything out of him or not?" came a man's fractious voice. "The whole idea of your staying here, Shelley, was to get some bloody information for me."
"I did try to ask him, but I didn't want to lay it on thick. It might have made me look very suspicious. I noticed his antennae were already on alert. He doesn't want me staying here. I practically had to invite myself."
"Well, what was the point of your bloody staying here if you failed to do any digging? I told you to express some interest in the pendant, to ask if you could see it. But no, you couldn't do a simple thing like that, could you? It's not rocket science, Shelley. Now we're back to square one, looking for a needle in a haystack all over again. Don't you get it, Shelley? This pendant will change our lives. It's worth a bloody fortune for us. Have you any concept what that means? Money, and lots of it."
"I did try to ask him about the pendant, I told you. He said the pendant needed cleaning. I said surely his aunt would have cleaned it by now."
"Well, what did he say?"
"He said he had no idea about things like that."
"What a bloody useless girlfriend you are, Shelley. Sometimes you have the brains of a gnat. Why did you not ask him where his aunt keeps her collectibles? We've looked in her cellar, in every cupboard here. We've already ransacked the entire place twice over, and not found a bloody thing. And our plan for you to stay here to find out answers has gone completely pear-shaped. You're bloody useless at doing anything."
Stuart was gripped with tiredness again. It was clear he had been drugged. Shelley must have put something in his wine. He wanted to fight back, but the struggle to keep his eyes open was a losing battle. He knew at once that Shelley had come into his house with guileful intent. The object of her interest was the pendant his aunt had purchased at an antiques fair of all things. It was a while later when Stuart was woken to freezing blasts of ice-cold water being poured down his face in order to wake him up. The icy coldness of the water shocked his system so fiercely out of his tranquil place of slumber that his eyes bulged out of their sockets like a gog-eyed goldfish. His head was pounding fiercely with a thundering headache. He felt sluggish, but the stinging ice-cold water was like an electric shock, jolting him wide awake. He could feel a man's hand slapping him hard across the cheeks. "Wakey, wakey, Stuart!"
came a man's raspy voice. Stuart realised he couldn't move his hands and feet. To his horror, he was to discover he'd been tied to his aunt's dining-room chair with rope. Stuart looked at the man in alarm. "What do you want with me?" he stammered. The man was enormous. Every part of his body bulged with muscle. The biceps in his arms were so gargantuan they almost bubbled, accentuated further by the flimsy white string vest he was wearing. There was no doubt in Stuart's mind at all that this man spent arduous, gruelling hours in the gym lifting weights to acquire the quintessential bums of steel. He was an intimidating and mean-looking man, the kind of person you would avoid sitting next to on a bus or tube at any cost. If you were a woman on her own, you would almost certainly cross over to the other side of the road if you saw the likes of him coming along. For there was something in his demeanour, the way he moved his body, the way he looked at you, that was disturbingly fierce. It rattled your cage. He was the quintessence of the perfect gangster. The man's bald head shone like a new penny. His mean eyes were piercing blue in colour. They seemed more pronounced on a face without hair. It was like they blazed out of their sockets at him, like two blue opals. But in their depths he could discern a cold iciness that was so penetrating that his vicious, foreboding stare could easily have cut glass. "Stuart, my name is Lovell," he said, waving around a revolver in his hands that he was not yet pointing at Stuart, but the innuendo hung in the air like a hot air balloon, warning of its imminent employment, should the need actually arise. It was like the words, "If you don't cooperate with me, I'll blow your head off," may not have been articulated or implicated, but it didn't matter, for what was left unsaid was a whole lot more efficacious. Shelley was standing at the gangster's side, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. Stuart knew he should never have let that young woman into his aunt's house. This had all been a duplicitous plan from the very start. The two of them were in on this together. These were the very people who had pilferaged and plundered his aunt's house on 2 previous occasions. "What's going on?" he asked. "What do you want?" Stuart could feel his heart thundering in his chest. It was so incredibly loud he could hear every single beat, as clearly as you might hear the chimes on a grandfather clock. "Nothing much, Stuart. Nothing much," repeated Lovell. "Nothing to worry your pretty head about, Stuart. On the contrary, we'll be out of your hair if you cooperate with us. We would like to know where your aunt keeps the pendant she brought from the antiques fair." "I don't know where it is," said Stuart. "That's not good enough, Stuart. For one, I don't believe you," he said with a nasty snigger on his face. "And 2, I'm not a bloody idiot. I'm not about to buy into your crap. You know where your aunt keeps her collectibles. Where are they?" "I told you, I don't know. I really don't know." The obnoxious looks Lovell was giving Stuart caused the 30-year-old to tremble in his boots, for the belligerent, capricious man seemed unhinged and exceedingly dangerous. Stuart could feel the icy-cold feel of the revolver being prized against his temple. He flinched. "Are you insane? You can't go pointing a rifle at me, or tying me up like this. I told you I don't know where it is. Why would I know something like that? I haven't got the slightest interest in any antique." "Stuart," whispered Shelley, "try and think where it is, will you? Lovell will rarely beat you up if you don't." "Shelley's right, Stuart. Not only will I beat you up within an inch of your life, but after I've done so, I will unload this revolver in your head, blow your brains away. And I'm not joking either. So start talking now, 'cause time is running out for you very fast, my man. And I'm not very patient." "I told you, I don't know." "Is that right, Stuart?" said Lovell, his raspy voice becoming enraged. "Is that bloody right?" he said, punching Stuart so hard in the face he could feel his front tooth crumble and break in his mouth, while trickles of blood seeped down his nose, splashing over his white shirt, bespeckling them in spatters of blood. He could taste the metallic taste of blood on his tongue. Then Stuart felt a big leather boot pounding in his guts. He recoiled in pain, raising his hands. All right, please, stop. I'll tell you what you need to know. I'll tell you where to find the pendant, but stop, please stop." "There's a good boy," said Lovell, purring like a Cheshire cat. "I told you it's so much easier when you cooperate." Stuart pointed to the bookshelf in the living room. There's a lever on the side. It opens out into a secret room.
Lovell pressed the lever down. The bookcase creaked open like a door to reveal a hidden room, filled with boxes piled high on top of each other. Lovell audibly gasped. He stared at the incredible sizable antiques collectibles in Aunt Hattie's secret space.
Now that's more like it. I told you there was a place she would keep her secret stash.
Stuart could hear Lovell and Shelley searching through his aunt's stuff, opening up boxes and scrabbling through them to search for the locket. It would take them hours to get through all the stuff, he thought. His arms were already aching from being tied up so hard. "You're going to let Stuart go, aren't you, Lovell? Once we've found the locket," he heard Shelley ask the man. Stuart could hear the uncertainty in her voice, as if she doubted Lovell's integrity. Perhaps deep down in her gut, she discerned that her irresolute, ambivalent boyfriend would go beyond the bounds of what is deemed as acceptable to safeguard his own skin.
"Are you kidding, Shelley? Once I've found the locket, it's a bullet in the head for him. I can't afford to have him identify me, can I? We'll stage the place to look like an armed robbery. No one will suspect a bloody thing."
"But you can't kill him," said Shelley. "That's murder, Lovell. You can't do that."
"I'll do as I damned well like."
Shelley crept out of the secret room. She came over to Stuart, putting her finger to her mouth. "I'm going to untie you," she whispered. "When you get the chance, you must escape. Go and hide in the woods. He's going to try and kill you, but bide your time. Wait until he's distracted, or he'll be on to your game." Shelley quickly untied Stuart. Stuart whispered, "Thanks," and continued to remain on the chair, waiting for the perfect moment to flee from the house. Lovell's voice could be heard.
"Shelley, where are you? I've only bloody gone and found it."
Stuart watched as Lovell brought out the unpretentious-looking locket.
"This must be it," he said, his voice sounding euphoric. "Go and get me some cleaning products from the kitchen, will you, Shelley?"
Stuart watched Lovell polishing up the locket, with an expression of extreme annoyance creeping up on his face.
"It looks like bloody glass, doesn't it?" he said to Shelley, taking out a newspaper article from his pocket and comparing the picture of the locket in the article to the one that he had in his hands. "It's the very same locket, but this one is definitely glass. Read the article again to me, Shelley. Maybe I've missed something here."
"An unlikely lottery win of a different kind," read Shelley. "A locket belonging to Lady Penelope Grey, who resides in the town of North Berwick, East Lothian in Scotland, was recently sold at a very standard antiques fair at Clayson Farm Antique Show in Central Washington State Fairgrounds by her grandson, who lives in Washington, and was disposing of some of his grandmother's antiques. It is rumoured that the locket is worth millions of dollars. On the surface it is described as a mundane-looking piece that is unlikely to grab your attention, but there is more to the piece than meets the eye. Whoever finds the locket, Lady Penelope Grey claims their lives will be forever changed, for the pink diamond it contains is one of a kind. When Lady Penelope was asked whether she would expect the locket back, she said certainly not. It was sold accidentally when my grandson was cleaning out some of my old antiques, so as far as I'm concerned, whoever buys the pendant, well, it belongs to them. It is serendipitous that it ended up in their hands. I wish them lots of luck in the future."
"This must be it," said Lovell, cleaning the jewel rigorously and comparing it to the locket in the picture. "It's one and the same, but this isn't pink, it's opaque. No wonder the grandson threw it out. It definitely looks like glass."
"But the article says on the surface the locket is mundane. This looks mundane on the surface, doesn't it?" said Shelley. "But it says the stone it contains. Notice the word contains. Maybe the stone is inside the locket. Maybe there's a secret lever that opens up, much like the bookcase did. It looks like it could contain something, doesn't it? It's very thick on all its sides. Perhaps the stone is inside the locket."
"Good thinking," said Lovell.
He began to rigorously press the sides of the pendant. It suddenly popped open like a jewellery box, and inside the locket was the most exquisite pink diamond that glittered and sparkled as it hit the light. One look at that sparkling stone. You knew it was worth an absolute fortune.
"This is it," said Lovell. "This is the precious diamond. It's worth a bloody fortune. I'm bloody rich," he said. "I'm bloody rich."
Lovell's eyes filled with greed, while his jaw jiggled with enthusiasm. Shelley looked exceedingly annoyed.
Correction! You mean we're bloody rich? Correction! I mean I'm bloody rich, Shelley, said Lovell, pointing the revolver directly at her. What did you think I am, Shelley? A complete, total and utter mug? Did you really think that I was going to share my vast fortune with you? Are you kidding? Not a chance. But I was the one that recognised the pendant in the paper. Without my input, you would have known nothing about it at all. Do you really think I give a damn about that, Shelley? You know your problem, little Shelley, is you're easily duped. It's so easy to pull the wool over your eyes. You're very naive. But you said you loved me, said Shelley, her eyes filling with tears. I did this all for you, for us. I didn't want any of this. I stuck my neck out on the line for you. Lovell scoffed his vindictive smile, which turned downwards into a scowl. I would say anything, wouldn't I, to get my hands on the loot? But why would I be interested in a girl like you, Shelley? You're nothing to me, he said, spitting on the ground with disgust. Absolutely nothing. Do you think I have respect for a girl who throws herself at me like a cheap tart? So what are you going to do, then? Are you going to kill me too? Asked Shelley. You took the words out of my mouth, Sunshine Girl, said Lovell, raising his revolver, pulling back the trigger and shooting Shelley in the chest with one mighty blow. The expression on his face was indifferent and apathetic, the noise ear-piercingly loud. Shelley fell back on the ground with an almighty thump. Blood spurted out of the wound on her shirt. It was so surreal that for a moment Stuart thought he had to be dreaming. Surely this was not really happening. This sort of thing happened in the movies, not in real life. Shelley's eyes seemed to glaze over. Her body became motionless and unmoving. Stuart's stomach went as cold as ice. He knew it was his turn next to have a bullet unloaded in his head, but he was no longer restrained by the rope that Shelley had untied for him. In a trice, with the athletic prowess and grace of a cheetah, he leapt quickly from the chair. The jerking, swift action took Lovell off guard. Stuart bolted through the house at one hell of a speed, hearing a couple of bullets being lambasted behind him. His heart was thundering violently in his chest. His fingers were trembling and shaking as he hurriedly opened the door. His fingers so wet and clammy, they slipped on the doorknob, but he managed to turn it and open the door hurriedly, where he raced out into the dark night. Stuart made a beeline for the opening in the fence, running so fast it felt as if his legs had been hardwired for speed due to the adrenaline surging through his veins, giving him that quintessential edge. In his gut, Stuart knew the woods were the safest place for him to take cover. It was a tenebrous night, but the soft silvery shadows of the moon danced through the darkened firmament, blowing enough kisses of ethereal light for Stuart to see his way very clearly. A fragrant cool breeze blew against his cheeks as he entered the woodgrove. The tall Douglas fir trees gathered together in towering groups, like tall, slender giants, penciling into the sky like dense skyscrapers. Their verdant boughs were swaying ominously in the breeze, giving the woods an ethereal, spectral impression. For on this night the sounds of the crickets chirping, the frogs croaking was absent, as if they were boycotting the woods tonight, refusing to play their reassuring notes, to envelop the forest with the sense of stability and security that Stuart craved. For silence had a dreadful, inauspicious, portentous sound all of its own. It was unduly heightened this night by the sounds of Lovell's heavy rubber boots trailing behind him. Stuart realised that Lovell might be a beefcake in every regard, but he was not a fast runner, which was where he had the distinct, definite edge. Stuart ran to take cover behind a large tree, where he fiddled around in his back pockets for a cell phone so he could quickly call the police. But his cell phone was missing. Of course he should have realised that Lovell would have removed his cell phone from him before he'd tied him up, when he was so drugged that he hadn't been aware of a single thing. Lovell was getting close to him. He could hear the man's heavy breathing, the crackle of bark and leaf litter popping under his shoes like popcorn. He was out of breath, but searching around the woodgrove for any signs of Stuart, knowing he couldn't have gone far in the dark. I know you're here, Stuart. I'm not leaving until I put a bullet through your head. I'm not stupid enough to leave any evidence behind me. That's a classic mistake most criminals make. You know what they say about secrets, Stuart? You share them with no one, so no one betrays you. My dad taught me that lesson, Stuart, so I'm not leaving the woods until you come out. I know you're around here, somewhere. You can make it hard for yourself, but you're going to delay the inevitable. 'Cause you're not getting out here alive, mate. If I have to wait here until the first light of the morning, I most certainly will. I'm not going anywhere, Stuart, just so you know."
Stuart clung to the side of the tree like an oyster on a rock, trying desperately not to move a muscle or to even breathe. He was afraid, amidst the baleful sound of silence, that Lovell would be able to hear his own heart racing through his chest. All of a sudden there was a strange roaring sound in the woodgrove, unlike anything that Stuart had ever heard before. It sounded not unsimilar to a lion's roar. The first thought that came to his mind was that a mountain lion was loitering around. No wonder the forest was steeped in silence. He could see that Lovell's face looked a little discomposed, as if he was focusing his revolver on the noise. Then there was the sound of heavy feet moving through the trees. They did not sound like the feet of a nimble mountain cat, but something substantial, of great might and girth and weight. Whatever it was appeared to be breaking tree limbs, shaking branches, moving ever closer, getting ever nearer. It was like the forest seemed to groan and shake under its impending weight.
"Nice try, Stuart. You think you can scare me, mate. I'm not easily fooled, you know. I'm going to find you."
Then suddenly, thundering through the trees at one hell of a speed, and standing up straight and tall, yards away from Lovell, was the most enormous creature Stuart had ever seen in his entire life. The revelation hit him hard like a brick to the head as he peered at the prescient creature behind the tree where he was hiding. "Oh my God, it's a Bigfoot," he thought. The moonlight danced through the trees. Its soft shaft seemed to cascade over the Bigfoot in a shimmering light that seemed to highlight the ends of the Bigfoot's hair. Stuart surmised it was easily over 8 foot tall, about 700 pounds, with overlong arms, and an incredible body covered in long flowing hair. But the size of this thing was gargantuan. It possessed a cone-shaped head and a remarkably human face, with deep-set dark eyes that gave off a menacing, very disturbing red eyeshine. At first Lovell was so confounded to see the Bigfoot that his mouth dropped open in astonishment. His eyes widened. His body trembled. It would seem that at first the Bigfoot was as bewildered to see Lovell as he was indeed to see the Bigfoot. For a moment they stared at each other incredulously. Stuart marvelled how this human beefcake looked like a tiny doll next to the giant-like creature, whom overshadowed him in size, girth, and weight. Lovell pointed his revolver at the creature, but he was shaking so much that the revolver was wobbling precariously in his hands. He tried to run backwards in the woods, keeping his revolver pinned on the Bigfoot, making the classic mistake of unloading one of his bullets in the Bigfoot's direction. But the bullet brushed past the Bigfoot's long hair and went gliding directly into a tree trunk, where it parked its metal cylinder deep within the trunk. The creature growled. It pulled back its thin lips to expose its human-like teeth, for it was in no doubt that Lovell had attempted to kill it. Now it wanted revenge. Stuart's first impression of the Bigfoot was it had been a benevolent, easy-going sort of guy. He was sure that if Lovell had not reacted so adversely towards the creature, he would have been left unscathed. But now the Bigfoot was angry, very, very angry. Stuart could feel the energy of its indignation and fury. The creature seized the revolver from Lovell's hands, throwing it into the forest, where it landed with a thud in some obscure place, possibly now hidden by the shrubbery and ferns. The creature then grabbed Lovell with his overlong arm. Lovell was fighting back with all his might, but his attempts to escape were pathetic. The Bigfoot picked Lovell up by the waist, turned him upside down, so he was dangling by his legs. He pummelled him against the tree so forcefully that you could hear every bone in the big man's body just break and crack, and then he fell flat on the ground, his body completely lifeless. The Bigfoot stood over Lovell's body, testing it with his feet to ensure he wasn't actually moving. He seemed fully satisfied that Lovell was really dead. That was when he noticed Lovell was wearing a locket around his neck. He studied it curiously, pulling it off his neck hard, and then examining it with his thick sausage-sized fingers. The locket naturally opened, revealing the sparkling pink diamond. The Bigfoot audibly gasped. He threw the pendant on the ground, making a happy whooping sound, as he glided through the forest with the precious stone in his hands.
To cut a long story short, I'm delighted to inform you that Shelley had pretended to be dead when her boyfriend shot her through the chest, realising that if she didn't, he would continue to shoot her until he was absolutely certain she was a goner. Luckily, the gunshot had missed any major arteries, and given the next-door neighbours heard the gunshot going off, the emergency services were called immediately to the house. They were able to stabilise Shelley, who revealed that her boyfriend had shot her at point-blank range and then run away. When Stuart visited Shelley in hospital, they both firmly decided not to elaborate to the police on any of the finer details in regards to their story, which meant Stuart would not mention the locket. Shelley apologised to Stuart profusely for setting him up, claiming that she was so blindsided by her love for Lovell that she had gone along with his insidious plan, even though she hadn't agreed with it. It was true that she had known Hattie through her mother, and recognised the locket in the newspaper. She had made the mistake of mentioning it to Lovell, who had devised a nefarious plan to get his hands on the jewel. But she had no idea that Lovell's plan would turn so murderous. I never realised quite how wicked he was. I'm so sorry, Stuart. I really am. I would have done anything for Lovell, but I draw the line at murder. I'm sorry for everything I did.
That's all right, said Stuart. I forgive you.
Stuart kept his mouth shut about the Bigfoot he'd encountered, and surreptitiously fixed the hole in Hattie's fence. It was a long while before the bones of Lewis were finally discovered in the woodgrove, but the manner of which he had died remained a mystery. Stuart returned Hattie's locket to the secret room behind the bookshelf, so she was none the wiser about the havoc the simple item of jewellery had created. He was secretly rather relieved the Bigfoot was now in ownership of the precious jewel, for he knew without a shadow of a doubt that kind of money could incite a great deal of evil, as let's not kid, he nearly lost his life over that locket. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.